Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk to you about the Bureau of Labor Statistics and how we obtain employment projections, which are then used in many ways that Kathy's already talked about for students and others to make decisions about their training, education, their careers, and future job opportunities. So hopefully I'm going to use it. Oh, okay, it worked. So I think by the end of my talk, you'll hopefully appreciate that it's a rather complicated modeling process. And I thought I had 30 minutes. I found out I have about 25 minutes. So that means I'm only going to be able to give you even briefer high-level overview of how BLS models employment projections. So my goal really is to just give you a framework and links and resources so that if you do want to know more about the process, then you could delve into it, because they will have slides, right? The slides? Okay, good. So after I give you a brief introduction about the Bureau of Labor Statistics and who we are, I'm going to sort of go to the end product of the employment projections, which is the Occupational Outlook Handbook. And I have to also then give you some kind of background information about what goes into the employment projections, in particular the data sets that we use and the industry and occupational classifications, because the employment projections are published for detailed occupations and industries. Then finally I'll get into the process and models, and I probably won't have time to say much about the resources and references, but they're there at the end should you want them. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics is one of 13 principal federal statistical agencies. We're responsible for publishing several principal federal economic indicators. The agencies that I have highlighted in red here are the ones who provide some information that's used for the employment projections. Right now, we don't have a BLS commissioner. We're waiting for one to be appointed. Okay. Which, from my understanding, that might happen soon, hopefully. But anyway, our previous BLS commissioner, Dr. Erica Groshin, she came up with this acronym that described the principles of the BLS. But I really think it's the same principles that federal agencies follow. And I really like it because it spells aorta, and so this is really the heart of what we do. Yeah, it's really a good acronym, I think. But so in other words, the data, the statistics that we publish have to be accurate, objective, relevant, timely, and accessible to the public. Because what we do is a public good. So our mission is to collect, analyze, and disseminate economic information, but for the purposes of decision making. And we've heard about that quite a bit already today. We are an independent statistical agency. We don't have anything to do with policy. We don't do policy. We just produce the data and the statistics. And for those of you who want more information about us, the main website is bls.gov. So we are an agency in the U.S. Department of Labor. Besides publishing information about employment projections, we're also responsible for the monthly employment numbers that I'm sure you all hear about in the news. Another major economic indicator we're responsible for is the Consumer Price Index. So we do publish a lot of information about related to employment and labor. Not surprising. So why do we do this? We provide information to researchers. So those of you here who are researchers, you might be interested in using our data, maybe for your own analyses. And as you'll see with the employment projections and the Occupational Outlook Handbook, we do provide information for job seekers. So students and others who are trying to make career decisions would find what we do, I think, useful. So in accordance with those principles that I mentioned, we have to be objective and transparent about what we do. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes a handbook of methods. Here's the link to it and a screen capture. So we have to publish information about our methodologies, how we do our surveys, collect the data, do our estimates, and so forth. And if you search on employment, this is what you get. And if you look at where the arrow is, that is for the employment projections. That takes you to Chapter 13 of the handbook. That was one of my principal references in preparing the slides for today. The other major resource I used was from the employment projections website at bls.gov, and here is a screen capture of the website. If you look along the left over here, there's a lot of links to information about the program, results, overviews of employment, but the link at the bottom where I have the arrow is for documentation. So if you click on that, one of the documents you get to is information about the projections methodology. And that was the second major resource and reference for today's talk. So now I'm going to go to one of the end results of the employment projections. This is one of the major publications, I guess maybe one of the most popular publications that BLS puts out. And I'd like to know how many of you in here have heard of the Occupational Outlook Handbook? I know Kathy has. Some of you. Okay, good. And it is used by students. I think Kathy's daughter is in middle school, so that was surprising to me that somebody at middle school already knew about or knows about the Occupational Outlook Handbook. This publishes detailed information about job opportunities and more, we'll see in a minute, for many occupations and across different industries. So if you look at the summary section, there's information about pay, the education that's required for an entry-level position, work experience, what is the job outlook going to be. And I should say, I guess at this point, that the Occupational Outlook Handbook and the employment projections are done every other year. And then we project out for 10 years. So the latest version of this was for 2016. So it publishes the Occupational Outlook and employment projections to 2026. But it was just published recently in October 2017. So it does take almost a year for BLS economists and statisticians to produce the employment projections and the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So this is a flow chart of the employment projections process. We're going to get into more detail about the steps. But just to give you a little preview, even though there are 6 interrelated steps here, you could group them into 4 main categories. First is to understand what's the labor force going to look like 10 years out. What is a picture of the aggregate economy, so it's the big picture view of the economy. And then we have to kind of deconstruct that to get an idea of what is it going to look like in the industries, because what's the demand going to be, because the demand is going to drive the employment that's needed to achieve that demand, and then finally the occupations that will be needed. But before we get into those details, I'd like to just list the major data sources that we use. One is from the Census Bureau, and from there, the Census Bureau, we get projections of the resident population. What's that going to look like in 10 years? Amongst other things, from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, we get detailed measures of industry output. But the major sources of data come from other BLS programs. So the major source for employment projections is the Occupational Employment Statistics Program. This is an annual survey of establishments. It produces estimates of employment and wages for over 800 occupations and for some industries. And this is published for different resolutions of geography, so for the nation as a whole, states, metropolitan statistical areas. So to get the employment projections, we use occupational employment statistics to get the occupational distributions for non-farm wage and salary employment. Another source of data is the current employment statistics. This is a monthly survey of establishments. From here, we get estimates of non-farm employment, hours, and earnings. And this also is for different geographic areas. And for the purposes of employment projections, it gives us non-farm wage and salary employment industry levels. Another source is the quarterly census of employment and wages. So this is not a survey, it's a census. This is published quarterly, of course, at the county, state, and national levels. For employment and industry projections, this supplement, the QCEW supplements the OES and CES information on wage and salary and industry employment. Now, so what I've really been talking about so far are data sources that give us information about non-farm wage and salary. But the employment projections provides employment numbers for more than just non-farm. And so to get to those other types of employment, we use the current population survey. So this is a monthly survey of households. So BLS does not collect that data. That's conducted by the Census Bureau for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the current population survey provides information about industry employment in the agriculture areas, self-employed workers, and those working in private households. So, as I said, the employment projections are for different occupations and industries, so it's important to understand the classification systems that we use. So first I'll just mention that for occupations, those are classified using the standard occupational classification system. And there's over 800 detailed occupations. And occupations are grouped such that jobs in the groups have similar job duties, and some also could have similar skills in education and training requirements. Now, the SOC, these occupational codes are they're updated periodically. What I'm showing here is just a little snippet of a table that's a preliminary 2018 SOC definitions, but it's important to note that the employment projections currently use the 2010 occupational classification system. Now, I think it was Kay this morning that talked, she mentioned NAICS. So the NAICS is a North American industry classification system. So this is what we use to classify industries. And this was developed in conjunction with Canada and Mexico. And establishments or businesses are grouped primarily on their primary activities, so that establishments in one group do similar things and in similar ways. And just like with the occupational classification system, the NAICS classifications are updated periodically to reflect changes in the economies. Now, this uses a 6-digit hierarchical coding system. There's about 20 industry sectors, and approximately 25% of these are mostly goods producing, and so most of them are service producing. Here's just a partial view of the industry classification at the 2-digit level. So you see that up here is the goods producing, and then we have some service producing industries down below. Now, we're ready to get into the actual employment modeling process. So as I said, every 2 years, BLS issues these projections. And just from a high level, we first have to project what the labor force is going to look like in 10 years, because that's going to drive our aggregate demand, our gross domestic product in the future. The demand is going to then impact the industry output and the employment that's required for that output. And finally, then now that we know what the industries need, we could determine or project the occupations that the industries will need to get the required output. As I said, the latest projection in Occupational Outlook Handbook is hot off the press, October 2017. So the first step is the labor force projections. here it depends on the future size and composition of the population, and then trends in labor force participation. And we get the labor force participation categorized by age, gender, race, and ethnicity. So the Census Bureau provides projections of the resident population, and this projection is driven mostly by the birth rates, death rates, and net immigration. Now, immigration is probably the most important driver of this and the one that is most uncertain. Now, BLS has to convert these projections of the resident population into the civilian non-institutional framework, which is what we use for the employment projections. So to do that, we first take the projected population under 16, and we subtract that from the total resident population that we get from census. Next, we subtract the population of the armed forces, and finally, the institutional population is removed. And so the institutional population would be people who are, say, in correctional facilities, nursing homes, long-term care, and so on, because they're not out there working. So we need to do this conversion because we have to match the labor force participation rates that we get from the current population survey. So then we have to project the rates to our target year. And to do this, we first smooth the rates, then we transform the rates to logits that sort of linearizes them. So we regress them against time, extend to the target year, and then transform back to rates. So we have the labor force participation rates, we have the projected population, we multiply those together, and we get the labor force projection for each of the groups. Now, the labor force that's available in the target year is the most important external variable that we use in our next step, which is to get a projection of the economy as a whole in the target year. So in this step, we're interested in getting projections of the macroeconomy, in particular, what is the projection for the gross domestic product, major categories of industry demand, and total employment. And for this step, the BLS uses a macroeconomic model for the US that's licensed from this company, Macroeconomic Advisors. The model has some assumptions to it for it, but I think in terms of the view at BLS, the most important assumptions are here. Oh gosh, that was the end of it. I should hit the wrong button. All right, is the second bullet right here, that BLS assumes that we will reach a full employment solution in the target years. So this is the BLS view of the economy. So in other words, that any unemployment is going to be frictional, that workers who leave will leave for better jobs, and that any unemployment is not because of deficient demand. In other words, there's going to be enough demand out there for everybody who's in the labor force who wants to work will have a job. So that's kind of the optimistic view, I guess, of the future economy. Now, there's other variables that are needed for this macroeconomics model, and one of them is the labor force projections from step one. The other one is energy prices that we get from the Energy Information Administration. And then the third one is assumptions that are made about fiscal and monetary policy. And by the way, all assumptions that BLS uses can be found in the documentation that I've already mentioned. So we get different projections from this model listed in the upper bullet, but the ones that we really need for the next step are total non-farm payroll employment, productivity, and gross domestic product. So the demand that we have in the target year is going to be really key to explaining the future jobs that will be needed to meet that demand. In the previous step, we had projections of demand across industry sectors. In this step, BLS disaggregates these into more detailed categories. But maybe perhaps that's a little more important is that BLS, the gross domestic product that we have in the previous step, is like a total GDP, and BLS estimates more detailed projections of the gross domestic product. So the result of this step is industry final demand, and it's a final demand matrix where we have demand categories by commodity groups. And this is going to be used in the next step, where we're going to look at creating an input-output model for industries, because GDP reflects only the sales to the final purchasers. So in other words, if I buy a car, then that's reflected in the GDP. But a lot of other industries provide stuff that goes into building a car. So in other words, steel, maybe rubber, electronic components, and so forth. So we need to reflect that in our modeling. So the input-output model derives an industry-level estimate of the output that's required to produce a given level of GDP. So in this step, we have 4 tables. One is a use table that shows the use of commodities by industry. The second one is a make table that shows the commodity output of each industry. From the use table, we can get a direct requirements table, and from the make table, we get a market share table. And then we have a relationship that we get from the Bureau of Economic Analysis that converts these into a projection of commodity demand into a projection of industry output, and this is the relationship. So you see that it does include, it requires the direct requirements table and the market shares table. Now the next step, okay, so now we have the projected industry outputs. So we need to then project the employment in the industries that's needed to produce that output. So this combines data from the current employment statistics and the current population survey. So note that the CES provides, it's an establishment survey, as I said earlier, so it provides number of jobs. The current population survey is a household survey, and from this we really get the number of workers. And it's important to note that the employment projections produces total employment as a count of jobs, because a worker, an individual, could have more than one job. So we're not interested, so we're interested in the job, the number of jobs that are out there, not the individual workers. So some adjustment needs to be made because of that. So in industry employment, there's 2 models involved. One is we get industry employment as a function of the industry output and demand that we have from step 4 and other variables. And then another model provides average weekly hours as a function of time and unemployment rate. And then we can relate these together and produce a count of wage and salary jobs by industry. And so at the output of this step, we get final estimates of the projected employment for approximately 200 industries. All right, so now we have the employment at industries, and now we're then going to get the occupations that are needed for that. But before we do that, here is just a little view, a snapshot of what we get from step 5 for industry employment. And here we have employment and output. It's kind of interesting because over here on the employment side, we have for the base year 2016, we also have for 2006, so 10 years ago, 10 years prior, and then 10 years out to 2026. You can see that it's for various NAICS here, and you have information about the change and so on. So now for the final step, occupational employment. From this, we publish a national employment matrix, which describes the number of jobs in detailed occupations and within detailed wage and salary industries and for different classes of workers. So we get a count in thousands of the non-farm wage and salary, which is the largest group, self-employed, agricultural, and those working in private households. Now for the base year, we get the non-farm wage and salary employment from these 3 sources that I've already talked about. For the agricultural, self-employed, and private houses, that's from the current population survey. Remember, this was done by the Census Bureau, and they actually use a different occupational classification system than what BLS uses, so they have fewer groups. So there, again, there has to be some kind of conversion and mapping to to what BLS uses. Now, for the projected year, the projected wage and salary employment uses a framework that takes the industry employment that we have from step 5, and then it sort of distributes the occupations based on expected changes in the demand within an industry. So how do we get these expected changes? Well, BLS economists utilize different data sources, like articles in the literature, expert interviews, news stories, and so forth. And then they also identify certain factors that are likely to cause changes in the demand, occupational demand within industries. So some of these factors might be changes in technology. So for example, 3D printers that might affect things, changes in offshore domestic outsourcing, replacements of products and services, and so on. So they take all this into account and then produce the occupations across the industries. So that was for non-farm wage and salary. So what about self-employment and some of these other groups? Well, there's fewer data available for those groups. So they use a modified process. And there's an initial projection at the occupation by industry level, similar to what we've talked about already, but then that's aggregated to higher levels. And I should say, too, that in some cases, BLS might not publish in particular occupations and industries, maybe because of disclosure limitation issues, or maybe there's just too much error associated with it. So the data, the quality isn't enough for them to publish. So there's, so what we've already talked about are jobs available because of demand in industries. But sometimes there's jobs available because of occupational separations. People leave their jobs. And so BLS also models that and then includes that in their projections. So things to consider in the models, as I said earlier, the Handbook of Methods and the other documentation provides assumptions that are made at each step of the process, but there's some major assumptions that are used for the whole process. First is that any social and demographic trends are going to continue. There's not going to be any major wars, no major natural disasters. So I kind of wonder what's going to happen because of the hurricanes in 2017, right? And that the U.S. economy will be at full employment, as I mentioned earlier, and that existing laws and policies are going to hold. And I have to also emphasize the difference between projections and forecasts. So these are projections, they're not forecasts. So it's not like we're trying to say, what are my sales going to be next quarter or next year? So then we could say, all right, I'm going to predict my sales, I'll observe what my sales are, and then I could look at my prediction accuracy. These projections focus on underlying trends, not the actual outcomes. But that said, BLS does go back and evaluate the projections somewhat regularly and when the data are available. Okay, so I think I've got just a minute or less left. So I'll just quickly flip through these. Okay. Well, I'll end a little early then. So no, you don't have to click on that. Here's just a link to a little video on employment projections if you get bored. More publications other than the Occupational Outlook Handbook use employment projections. Here's some interesting ones that some of my colleagues gave me. States also use BLS projections to develop their own occupational projections, and there's some links here at the bottom. And also the monthly labor review is I guess it's kind of a journal that's published, open access, it's published by the BLS, it's available there. And whenever there's a new publication for, the release, I guess, for the employment projections in the Occupation Outlook Handbook, there's always a review article, overview article, and others in the monthly labor review. So that's another good resource. And if they go back and review it, then they also publish that in the monthly labor review. So I personally really like the OES data. I think it's a great resource. It's very easy to download, so here's a link to that data. They also have a mapping tool that I personally am working on to make it a little better, but you can get maps for various occupations, how the employment's distributed across the country, and other statistics like wages and so forth. And QCEW is another really great data set. And here's a link to a kind of a similar mapping tool. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you could download the data quite easily. So there's my contact information. If you have questions, I probably can't answer them, but I could certainly point you in the right direction. So thank you.